Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I am Chris Mackowski, and I am delighted today to be spending some time with a man I admire tremendously, Dave Ruth, the former superintendent of Richmond National Battlefield. Dave, thanks so much for being with us today.
Chris, thank you. You're so kind.
Oh, and the reason we have invited Dave to talk with us, aside from the fact that he's just an all-around good guy and has done some cool stuff, which we'll talk about today, but Dave is the recipient this year of the Emerging Civil War Award for Service in Civil War Public History, which is our top award that recognizes someone who's made a significant contribution to the field of public history. And Dave is just a shining star example of someone who has done so much for helping the public connect with the Civil War. So Dave, congratulations so much.
Thank you, Chris. I'm really honored. I really am. When you put 45 years into the National Park Service, it sticks with you for a long time. So having been retired for 2.5 years, it's great to think back fondly, to those last 20 some years at Richmond and all the fun we had and hopefully the difference we made.
Yes. And see, I like the way that you characterize all the fun we had, because I'm sure that there were times where you were sweating some bullets and it maybe felt a little less than fun at certain times anyway.
Yeah, well, that'll be in the memoirs for sure. There were always those moments, but they were the good times far outweighed the bad times, and the bad times were not uncommon for battlefield parks trying to expand, and we tried our best, and I think have some great opportunities now at the park to show for it and for people to come and connect with the resources that both the park and our partners I think work hand in hand to fulfill the destiny of what the park could be, and I think, like I said, we have something to show for it.
And I'm going to get into some of that in detail in just a few minutes, but you mentioned a second ago that you retired in 2018 after 44 years in the Park Service, which is an incredible run. And you started that as a fife player, as I recall.
Right. Yeah. I was working in a slaughterhouse during the summer and also doing reenactments. And somebody came up to me and said it was interested in doing a gig at Chancellorsville, playing a fife, or at least applying for it. And I said, my gosh, slaughterhouse or playing fife at Chancellorsville. So I applied for it and had the good fortune of getting it. And that was the beginning of the National Park Service experience in 1973.
Your career has taken you to Fort Sumter, to Independence, of course, as you mentioned here in the Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville area, before finally ending up down in Richmond. You want to trace some of those twists and turns for us?
I had the great fortune in 1970s of working at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania and Chancellorsville, and it's one of the most important shaping events, I think, of my career, because I was able to watch, particularly as a seasonal from some distance, but I was able to watch Bob Crick at work, and he became a mentor. I'm not sure he knew it right away at that point, but to me, in watching him operate as both a historian and as a manager, there were things that I observed that really clung in my mind of how to manage these battlefields, and one of them was the staff that we select and that we hire was probably key to everything that we can accomplish, and that stuck with me throughout all the twists and the turns, when I was particularly to a point becoming a supervisor and being able to select the employees that we were going to have working with us, and the work that he was doing in cultural landscape restoration, particularly at Spotsylvania and Chancellorsville during those years. I was not involved in them, but I certainly watched from afar, and I saw the challenges that Bob came up against, and And those certainly kind of locked in my mind as in Richmond, as we set about to do landscape restoration work at Gaines Mill and Malvern Hill. And so I saw what I thought was the key mission of what battlefield supervisors should be doing. And great interpretation and resources management obviously were key. And so that stuck with me, obviously, through the years. And, Fort Sumter was a time in which I remember going out to the museum with one of our young historians, and we looked around and we said, there's not one mention in this museum, and this was the 1980s, there's not one mention in this museum about the 54th Massachusetts and the Battle of Battery Wagner and all of the siege efforts up against Fort Sumter. And so in the 80s, we began to think about at Fort Sumter the story that was much more diverse than the kind of story that we were telling as interpreters there, whether it was causation and certainly participation. And at that time, we got very involved in the filming of Glory and North and South, and aside from the Hollywood piece of that, it really did a lot to open our eyes to this kind of stories that we must begin to tell. And like I said, that was in the mid 80s and towards the latter part of the 1980s that I think a lot of that was really taking hold, not just at Fort Sumter, but elsewhere. And so as I moved to Richmond, that was certainly my upbringing in Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania, and then the interpretive experiences at Fort Sumter that I was beginning to grapple with were things I think I brought with me. And then together working with the interpretive team there that was anchored initially by Mike Andrus, who started with me the same day at Manassas, but together kind of putting together what we saw the future of Richmond battlefields in all its complexity. That began in the early 1990s, and the staff that we began to look at and bring together, Bobby Crick, one of the great historians of the Park Service, and Mike Gorman, and Bert Dunkerley, and the list goes on. I'm sorry if I didn't mention everybody, but it became very obvious that to me as a superintendent, we had to support getting the best staff that we could. Ashley Whitehead, now Ashley Lusky, was another one of those folks. We had two people with PhDs on our staff, and that to me was absolutely remarkable, and it was challenging in a good way. But I think the kind of interpretation that we ended up engaging in during the 150th, I think all showed the type of talents that these people brought to the staff of the battlefield. And I couldn't have been more proud of the results.
And you talk about that as being one of the legacies that Bob Crick impressed upon you, finding the right people and putting them in the right place to make the right dynamic so that you have success as a result of that.
Oh, absolutely. Matter of fact, if I was still working, I'd be attending emerging Civil War seminars just to begin to cherry pick, the folks in attendance, because you got some great historians there.
I feel blessed that we have so many great folks to work with. I just have a great cadre of colleagues. I agree with you there.
Yeah.
You mentioned too that as you were finishing school, you had the opportunity to work with Bud Robertson, and he was an important mentor for you. And of course, Bud passed away this past year. What kind of influence did Bud have on you?
He was a dramatic influence on my career, and I met him when I was at Fredericksburg in that first summer season when he brought his Campaigning with Lee seminar through, and I saw this academic historian, and I was going to a state school in Pennsylvania, Millersville, and it was one of the reasons that I decided to transfer to Virginia Tech. and then got involved in the tech honors program. And as a result of that, I was able to do a series of independent studies and a thesis about the Battle of Salem Church under Dr. Robertson. And so we spent many times together, whether they were, talking about history, talking about interpretation of history, or commiserating over football injuries after he got blindsided by a lineman when he was officiating an ACC game on the Saturday before. So, his friendship is one that I miss dramatically, and I would love to go to his classes and just sit on the floor because there was no other room. His seminars absolutely totally filled the auditorium of more than 350 people. And so it was just amazing to see him at work as an academic historian and both as an individual as well. I feel that it's one of the great legacies that I came in touch with.
So he was a wonderful storyteller. I had the opportunity to meet with him several times, and just what an impressionable and kind-hearted fellow he was too.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Storyteller, and then Ed Barsh we bring up, with so many, great legacies of the National Park Service. Another one that, great fortune of working with throughout my entire career. And so there's a lot of people that, fortunately I had the chance to meet and work with and help shape my perspective on the National Park Service and history in general.
Now, when you first arrived at Richmond, this will sound like an exaggeration, but the park was almost like a postage stamp, pretty small. And when you left, it was dramatically different in size, scope, shape, and interpretation. What was it like to basically make your life's work the creation of this incredible battlefield?
You're right. I mean, we started with that. It's been long enough. The exact numbers are not quite as fresh in my mind as they used to be, but 750 acres is what it was when we began this effort to try to preserve battlefield lands around Richmond. And in the end, I think we accumulated slightly more than 4,100 acres. So it was a tremendous increase. And we had, when I first got there, I was not the superintendent, and the superintendent at the time, Cindy McLeod, arrived there in 1990. And I believe that she was given the charge of your number one priority is preservation of the battlefields. And so that was very clear to me that was my charge when she hired me to come in as the assistant superintendent. And so initially, it was very difficult because we had a lot of opposition. It was a time of pro-property rights, and what we were trying to do in Richmond was seen as going against those efforts of preserving private decisions about what to do with land, and we were going to get involved in condemnation. But when we made the decision to work with our superiors to remove condemnation from our legislation, we began to settle down some of that opposition. And in 2000, we got new legislation that didn't talk about condemnation. So we got legislation to expand. And we also got $2 million as part of that. Thank you to the Virginia delegation that was in power at the time. And so with distinct boundaries and with funding, we went to work right away. And it was slow at first. And much of what the success of the park was is not just because of what we did, but it was initially the APCWS, Association for the Preservation of Civil War Sites, that we worked with, and the Douglas Freeman branch of the Association of the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities. These were external partners that we could not have done the work that we did without them. And we had a core of volunteers who lived outside of the park. And not only did they do great interpretation for us, but they were mindful of every real estate sign that they saw on their way home from work. And many of them lived in Hanover and Henrico and would call me and say, hey, we see a for sale sign out here, and that would set things in motion rather quickly. And having such great partners like now the American Battlefield Trust, and the Freeman branch, and Richmond Battlefield Associates. We move rather slow in government side of acquisition, but when you have partners like that can step in immediately and move forward with acquisition, and then we in turn purchase from them, it was a win-win situation. And having great community partners, and I'm talking about both residents and the counties themselves, the administrators. We're very clear on our goals of what we were trying to achieve, and find ways for the goals of the counties to merge with the kind of open space thoughts that we had for the battlefields. And so when we had to do minor battlefield adjustments, minor boundary adjustments, we didn't have opposition for that. We were able to work hand in hand, because that's a local issue.
Yeah.
And as they say, all politics are local. It was certainly true in Richmond. And so, it was a great internal and external partnership with the staff we had and the people we were working with to make this come to fruition.
And to me, that's the reason, when we were considering you for the award, I was like, the sorts of coalitions that Dave has had to put together, the politics he's had to play, to help people understand the appreciation of what history means to a community, but also the economic impacts and just all these different moving parts, and your ability to make all that happen and come together and work with willing sellers and just make it a win-win situation, as you said, to me is just an incredible example for other people to be able to follow. It's a great template.
Well, thank you. The other piece too was then once, we had it, what are you going to do with it? And so we could have basically mothballed it, or we could work to try to make it accessible. And that was the other key part. And that's where this incredible staff, sorry, we have having a thunderstorm right overhead here. But the incredible staff came together to create trails, to create wayside exhibits, to create opportunities for people to interact with the lands. And so I think that was the other piece to it. I think that was so important and at least for me, so fulfilling to see that visitor be enthused about being able to tramp on the land.
Yeah, and you've talked about that before. Like, we've got this new piece of property that we have just saved. We've brought it into the park. We need to get people on it as soon as possible, or as practicable.
Right, exactly. And some may have felt maybe we were too ambitious, because then you also have to maintain it. But that was something we tried to look at closely with the kind of resources we had and volunteers that we were able to bring to help us. And so together, I think what we did hopefully created great experiences.
Now, one thing you said that worked to your advantage was that the expansion of the Richmond metro area has tended to be toward the north and west, whereas a lot of the battlefields that you particularly felt were threatened were toward the east and south. Can you talk just a little bit about how geography helped you out?
You're absolutely right. The community development was working towards the west. It doesn't mean that there was not going to be development pressures to the north, the northeast, or the south. And working with the counties again, when there were development pressures, particularly in Hanover County, we worked with the county to develop types of zonings, and in a conservation zoning that required a percentage of the property be preserved in open space. And so as a result of that, you had clustered development. And in several cases, we were able to go ahead and work with the developer and the county to fulfill the conservation zoning. And then the balance of the land that was not developed, that was in open space, was donated to the park. We acquired one tract of 100 acres, actually at Cole Harbor, the southern end of the Confederate line. We acquired through the conservation zoning, where the development was clustered, and we acquired all the Confederate trenches, and well, some of the Confederate trenches on the southern end, and anyway, a piece of the battlefield that otherwise would have not been saved.
And I look at the successes out at Glendale and Malvern Hill, where so much of the battlefields have been able to be saved. Whereas if they'd maybe been a little closer to the city, they might have gotten swallowed up a little sooner.
Absolutely, and particularly at Malvern Hill and Glendale, we had owners who had large tracts of land, and initially weren't certain that the National Park Service was going to be the ultimate acquisition decision, but here was where the external partners moved in, and in some ways, in their inimitable style, they were able to convince the landowners in a way that we were not able to, that preservation was a great opportunity for them. And also when they were finding that they were getting appraised values, it was a win-win again. But it was through our external folks that a lot of the preservation at Glendale and Malvern Hill occurred. One landowner, I recall at a public meeting saying, you're not going to get any of our property ever. And it was one of the largest land holdings at Glendale. And so in the end, the trust and its partners were able to talk to the landowner in a way that it ultimately worked out that the acquisitions were made, and now they're very good partners with the National Park Service, and I think I'm very grateful that they did what they did.
Now, you and I, in a conversation we had a couple years ago, we were sitting in your office, and you talked about how that had once upon a time been your war room. And you talked about Bobby Crick being your #1 lieutenant and mapping things out. And you had charts and maps all over as you're trying to sort of map out your long-term vision for the park. Put me in that room again and help our listeners and our viewers understand what it was like to be in that war room and have to come up with a vision and then an approach for making that vision possible.
Right. Well, our legislation initially said that we could acquire anything within a 5-mile radius of whatever we owned. So basically everything within 3 counties would fall virtually within the zone of what we could acquire. So when we were trying to establish the new legislation, we were looking specifically at property and at targeted areas. So behind me is Malvern Hill, off to my left is Glendale, and there's Cold Harbor, and there is Gaines's Mill, and there's Drury's Bluff. And what fell between the cracks was Deep Bottom, because we were not, there was still kind of a bit of controversy. So we were thinking that we could not take all of Eastern Henrico. So we looked at Newmarket Heights, the site down off of Route 5, where 13 African-American soldiers won the Medal of Honor. So we had each of these battlefields in large format stretched behind us, and we were looking at troop movements, and we were looking at what were the important parcels within each of these maps, and there were colored pencils all around us that were indicating, where the core areas, as we even call them, just like the congressional study calls them, where were the most important lands, and we would do these large circles and then revisit them and have others come in and help us with what they knew about the particular battles. And so in the end, we came up with these circles that tried to include as much as the critical core fighting area. We were unable to really look at any of the supporting areas because we had to stick pretty much to where the fighting occurred. And so even amongst the historians, that sometimes became a little bit of a debate as to where certain things happened, because we did have a good bit of scholarship that was written about the battles, but still a lot of the interpretation of where units were and where major events took place on the battlefields sometimes was a little open to interpretation. And so we tried our best to look at primary sources, the official records, and really come up with where we thought these core battlefield areas were. And so for months, these maps kind of surrounded us and we lived with it. But it's what became the heart of the 2000 legislation for the park, and what then became this precise acreage that we were defined as being able to acquire for each of those battlefield areas.
Let me ask you to switch hats for just a second, because we've been talking about your role as a supervisor and administrator, but just going back to your roots as a historian and a history nerd and a history lover, you have a park that has major campaigns in 62 and 64, lots of ancillary actions that surround those major campaigns. That must have just been an incredible playground for you as a historian.
Oh, it absolutely is, and was. And there were, I mentioned the thing about scholarship. We had a lot that was written about these various sites around Richmond as well, but there were a lot of gaps. And so it was a great thing about having such an incredible staff, such a academic staff too, in a way that really could help to fill in some of the unknowns and do papers about some of the battlefields that we didn't know much about, or even see any real opportunities for us to preserve. Two of them that stand out in my mind is Yellow Tavern and Seven Pines. And working the information desk, how many times I can't recall people coming into the park, saying, well, where's Yellow Tavern or Seven Pines, being such a large battlefield, thinking that there must be something to see there, and seeing their disappointed faces when we tell them, I'm sorry, but those sites have been, you can go to the sites, but largely they've been developed, and there's very little to see of the battlefields themselves. And so while there are so many great stories, not only in the city itself, but outside of the cities, that unfortunately we have lost, figuring out ways of trying to keep those stories alive, nevertheless, is something that, frankly, I'm still looking at in some ways.
And I think that we're going to circle back to that because I'm going to ask you about Yellow Tavern in a second specifically. I think that, also having the city as a resource and being able to talk about the civilian experience, the political experience, the industrial and the economic experience, that's a whole nother layer of stories that most battlefields don't get to engage in. And you've been very successful as a park and as a staff of historians at really exploring those layers of that history.
Well, yeah, thank you. Yeah, and again, that was kind of cherry picking a lot of these important stories that we thought occurred within the city that we could translate into special walking tours. And I remember Ashley Lusky at the time doing an incredible walking tour of the bread riot that occurred, and something that many people have heard of, but to be able to walk around town and actually see the sites that were important for that story. And then, of course, we have to mention Lincoln's walk through the city that he made in April of 1865, and the work that Mike Gorman did as an historian to take the primary sources and reinterpret them and create these walking tours that really did take visitors from the embarkation point right up to the state capitol and the White House of the Confederacy, and walking in the steps of Lincoln and walking in the steps of the rioters, and walking in the steps as we did in the 150th for the time of the burning of Richmond and federal troops coming in, experiencing that in the way that we tried to present it in April of 2015. I think were all great opportunities that this tapestry of Richmond provided us, and almost it was such a challenge because we had all these battlefield resources virtually every year of the war, and so it was almost too energetic to begin thinking about, okay, how do we take ownership of some of these stories in Richmond and tell them as well. But we felt that was part of the charge that we had. It was not just the battlefields, but it was also Richmond. And we tried to do the best job we could with our partners. And there were many throughout the city, at both institutions and individuals who helped us along the way.
Speaking of partnerships and partners in the city, you were also involved in brokering a deal with what is now the American Civil War Museum to move the main visitor center from Chimborazo, which is a great site, to Tredegar, because of a relationship that you were able to help develop. And you want to talk about that just a little bit?
Well, we started with a small visitor center at Chimborazo that had been the visitor center since the 1950s, with just horrible exhibits. And so when we were again working on our new legislation back in the late 1990s, a group came to us from downtown and said, we think that we got an answer to your question about where your new visitor center should go. And so at that time, we began to formulate the plan to move down to the Tredegar Iron Works. I mean, what a wonderful site for a museum and visitor center. So that was opened in the year 2000, and talk about rushing exhibits. And I remember Eric Mink and myself actually just spending time writing exhibits at home. Before the pandemic, we were doing virtual work out of our houses just to not be interrupted and sit there and write interpretive label copy, because we were on such an abbreviated schedule to try to get the visitor center open when the partners felt that we should. So we had to, we started in 1998, and by 2000 we opened the doors with a complete new visitor center, and then erected the statue of Abraham Lincoln in 2003. And at the same time began working with our new partners, the American Civil War Museum, as they were working through the merging of that organization and the Museum of the Confederacy, that ultimately led to a new facility down there at Tredegar. So, and that's where we are today.
Yeah, yeah. Now, although you've been retired a couple of years, I know that you have remained busy. You want to talk a little bit about what you're doing to keep yourself going here in these post-retirement years?
Well, I think the great thing of working with a lot of organizations and folks while you're working is they do remember you, and so I've been invited to serve on a few boards, and so certainly in retirement, working with the Department of Historic Resources Board has been great, along with St. John's Church and the Hanover Tavern Foundation. But also personally, I also feel going into retirement is good to have a mission as well, and so thanks to Emerging Civil War, Don Fons and Bert Dunkerley and I worked on the Overland Campaign book, and always being fascinated by that question visitors posed when they came into the visitor center about where is Yellow Tavern, and what about that story prompted me to look at that in a larger way, to understand Yellow Tavern and the context of Phil Sheridan and Jeb Stewart and Stewart's last ride around Richmond, and I'm working on that right now. And unfortunately, the pandemic has caused a little bit of a challenge in trying to get into institutions to finish the research. So nevertheless, the writing has begun, and that's taking up the other part of my day. And so it's a great opportunity to be working on those kinds of things.
I'm in the same position, trying to finish up some revisions on some North Anna work I'm doing, and my inability to get into the archives is a little frustrating at the moment. But
Yeah.
Speaking of North Anna, so around the time you were about to retire, and the American Battlefield Trust had acquired the Jericho Mills Battlefield, and it was getting folded into Richmond National Battlefield Park. And I distinctly remember a conversation we had, and you said, yeah, I'm going to have to spend a lot of time down there along the North Anna doing some trout fishing just to make sure everything goes smoothly. I hope you've been able to take advantage of those sorts of opportunities in your retirement as well.
Not as much as I would like, but I have been able to get out there and do a little trout fishing. So hopefully there's more of that in the future.
I hope so too, because that has stuck with me, because I was like, that is such a lovely image.
Right, right. I had a lot of other passions I had hoped to follow through on, like golfing and tennis and fishing, and it seems like it takes a long time before you seem to catch up with everything that you have, you know, after working 45 years. And I hope to feel like I've made that, reached that point anyway, that I can get out and do a little bit more.
Well, we are all the better off for your 45 years of work, because the impact that you have made on the field of the Civil War, our understanding of Richmond, our understanding of the war, has just been better for all of us. And I have to say, I deeply appreciate the work that you have done on all of our behalves in the field.
Well, I really do appreciate that, Chris. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so, ladies and gentlemen, Dave Ruth, the recipient this year of the Emerging Civil War Award for Public Service in Civil War Public History. Dave, thank you so much for taking some time to chat with us today.
Thank you so much, Chris.